things to it, but really, what I believe is the biggest factor in it is the Israel lobby, is the fact that
Yeah.
the way our political system is set up, that it allows these lobby groups to have all this influence and allows foreign governments to get in on that lobbying. And the Israel lobby is really effective. I mean, you know, things have just changed in recent years, and it's funny because Donald Trump was recently kind of lamenting this. He said at a recent speech he gave at some pro-Israel event, he's like, 15 years ago, if not a single member of Congress, would speak bad about Israel, that they had that much control and influence over Congress, and he was saying it like it was a good thing. But what we've seen in recent years, we've seen kind of from the squad, people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, AOC to an extent, being critical of Israel. And that is kind of, even though it's a small amount, that is significant. And you see the way that they get attacked by the Israel lobby. And even Thomas Massie, who's a Republican, who doesn't really have the same criticisms of Israel, he just votes against aid to Israel. And they smear him, all these smear campaigns. So, it really is, I think, the lobby and the influence that they have over American politicians and kind of the think tank world, the people who actually influence U.S. policy. A lot of them are actually, like the people who shape the policy. They're ideologically very, very pro-Israel.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Hey, welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 241. I'm talking to Dave DeCamp of the Libertarian Institute and Antiwar.com. We're going to talk about the situation in Israel. We might talk a little bit about the situation with Ukraine, but I think Israel's worth covering right now. How are you, Dave?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I always like to start off with this question. How did you get into anti-war activism and libertarianism? How did you end up where you are right now?
Yeah, I mean, I became a libertarian through being anti-war, basically. I didn't really think too much about politics throughout my life, but I was always anti-war kind of instinctually. I was in high school during the Iraq War. And then when I was in my 20s, I started kind of paying attention to politics really around the 2016 election. I remember kind of being frustrated by nobody really seemed to care about the war issue at the time. And then when Trump became president, there was all these kind of fake scandals around him. And when he first came into office, he really ramped up the drone wars and other conflicts that Obama left him. And it just got virtually no attention. And I was involved in kind of some anti-war activism, and then I kind of channeled that into writing and started submitting articles to antiwar.com in 2018, 2019. They started just publishing them on the blog. And that's when I got to know kind of, that's not that long ago. I got into libertarianism and libertarian theory. I always liked Ron Paul. I remember I read End the Fed, like when it came out during his campaign, and it just made sense to me. But it was around that time that, I read Murray Rothbard and Mises and things like that, and kind of really adopted it as as my political theory that I thought was the best. And and I just ended up, I got into kind of covering the news for antiwar.com, and I ended up starting full time in 2020. So it is what I do for a living now. We moved out to the country, so it's nice to be able to work online and stay at home. Obviously, it's not, we don't make the most money doing this type of work, but it's something I'm proud to be doing, is working for the site, that's been around so long and has a lot of great people.
Yes. Yeah. So what do you think that some people are counting the days from October 7th last year. And I guess we still have some American citizens who are being held hostage, but this goes back a lot further than this. When do you think all of this started in Israel? I mean, I say 1917. Some people might even say earlier than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's about right. When the early Zionists really started going over there in the early 1900s, I mean, that is the root of the conflict. And it gets misrepresented, especially among kind of the mainstream American right wing, like people like Ben Shapiro. They compare Gaza to like another country, like Mexico, and they compare the West Bank to another country. But the fact is that the people that live there were either driven out of their homes in 1948, or they uh, live there but have been under Israeli military occupation since 1967, since the Six-Day War. So this all stems from that. I mean, you have to always go back to the root of the problem. And so it's not like this October 7th attack came out of nowhere. I mean, on the other hand, it was a big attack. I mean, Israel's never suffered something like that before. And there's a lot of questions about that, considering Gaza is one of the most, it's under an Israeli blockade, one of the most heavily surveilled places on earth. And there's all these indications that Netanyahu and the Israeli government had warnings that Hamas was planning something, yet they were able to pull off this big attack. So there's a lot of questions about that. But, for a lot of people, it's all about October 7th. And you'll see this a lot with people defending Israel's conduct in Gaza. They say, if Hamas just released the hostages. Well, it's been pretty clear for a while now that that's not what this is about. You see Netanyahu has basically done everything he could to sabotage the chances of another hostage deal with Hamas. They made a deal last year that released over 100 Israeli hostages. And Gallant, his defense minister, who he recently fired, all these other Israeli officials, all these Israeli media outlets have said that Netanyahu basically did what he could to sabotage the chances of a deal to keep the war going. So it's not about the hostages at this point, and you could clearly see by what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, is it true that before Zionism, the last time there was any kind of war in this exact section of the world was during the Crusades, which I believe were the 12 and 1300s? I mean, there was peace in Palestine in the area. I don't know. Maybe there was, obviously there might have been an armed robbery here or there, but no, full scale war.
I mean, as far as I know, I don't know going all the way back to the Crusades, like about every conflict, but they lived in relative harmony under the Ottoman Empire in that part of the world. The Muslims, the Christians, and Jews, again, relative for that time, but they all, were there. And there's all these ancient Christian communities that have also been affected and displaced by Israel and everything. But yeah, I mean, again, when you look at what Zionism is, what the Zionist project was, the establishment of the modern state of Israel, there was a piece of land where people lived, and all these people from Eastern Europe, from other parts of the world, came in basically to take their slice of this land, and they displaced people and ethnically cleansed the Arab population. And this is obviously the starting point when you talk about the root of anything. And it's been this unresolved issue. I mean, you can't keep people, you could say if Israel took the land that it has, what we call proper Israel, not including the West Bank and Gaza, if they just kept that and say even if they gave the West Bank back to Jordan after the 67 war and the Gaza Strip back to Egypt, it could be a very different situation today. There probably wouldn't be this conflict, but they've kept these people under military occupation with no rights, no property rights for, since 67. So, you can't do that and not expect conflict.
And it's not like we don't see migrations happen peacefully. I've certainly seen plenty of people from California move here to Austin. But they buy people's houses, and the people want to sell, and everybody, and you don't see a fight over it. Although there's certainly plenty of people in Austin who'd love to see the California people go, but at least the old Austin residents. But why is, I mean, if everything's if all these land transfers are consensual, then why would there be any violence? I mean, I've heard that the government of Israel owns 90% of the land, and you basically just rent your land from Israel. Is that how it works? Or
yeah, I'm not sure the exact percentage, but I know it's the majority of the land, and you basically lease it from the government. And then with the early Zionists, there were in the very beginning, there were the Arabs were like, basically letting them come and buy land, and there wasn't really a conflict. Obviously, there was tensions, but things didn't really stir up until the Zionists made it clear. I mean, they would go through marches through
Yeah.
Jerusalem, armed with weapons and saying that this is their land. I mean, that's going to
Yeah.
start some conflict. And then eventually they did actually drive people and expel people from their homes and villages. Um, so, yeah, I mean, and this is still happening today. That's the thing in the West Bank.
Mhm.
And now it's happening in Gaza too. But in the
Yeah.
West Bank, this has been happening for decades. This kind of slow, basically like de facto annexation. The Palestinians again have no property rights. If one of their houses gets damaged or destroyed, they can't rebuild it. Or if they do, then Israel comes in and bulldozes
Mhm.
it. Israeli settlers push them out of their homes, threaten to kill them to get them to leave, and they're backed by the Israeli military. It's not the military going in and kicking them out, but they know, they're backed by the military and the Israeli police. And this has just gotten worse in the past year since October 7th. Like if what's been happening in the West Bank over the past year was happening kind of separate from Gaza, like say that war wasn't happening, this would be what everybody would be talking about is the settler encroachment in the West Bank. It's just gotten so bad.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's just they're taking advantage of, you talk about the war in Lebanon. There's just so much going on right now that the settlers are taking advantage and really just going for the land grab in the West Bank.
Maybe even if you have a sale, you might have a case where a house that was suddenly worth $100,000, that they can only get $10,000 for it, and they're going to think, well, because of the conditions involved. Uh, so yeah, so now brings up the next question, Dave. What is the origin of this special relationship with Israel? I mean, why should Americans care about this at all? Why do Americans have to care about this at all?
Well, I mean, there's a few things to it, but really, what I believe is the biggest factor in it is the Israel lobby, is the fact
Yeah.
that the way our political system is set up, that it allows these lobby groups to have all this influence and allows foreign governments to get in on that lobbying. And the Israel lobby is really effective. I mean, you know, things have just changed in recent years. And it's funny because Donald Trump was recently kind of lamenting this. He said at a recent speech he gave at some pro Israel event, he's like, 15 years ago, if not a single member of Congress, would speak bad about Israel, that they had that much control and influence over Congress. And he was saying it like it was a good thing. But what we've seen in recent years, we've seen kind of from the squad, people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, AOC to an extent, being critical of Israel. And that is kind of, even though it's a small amount, that is significant. And you see the way that they get attacked by the Israel lobby. And even Thomas Massey, who's a Republican, who doesn't really have the same criticisms of Israel, he just votes against aid to Israel. And they smear him, all these smear campaigns. So, it really is, I think, the lobby and the influence that they have over American politicians and kind of the think tank world, the people who actually influence U.S. policy. A lot of them are actually, like the people who shape the policy. They're ideologically very, very pro-Israel. So there's a lot of reasons, but I really do think that the
both the lobby and the ideological view of a lot of people who actually shape U.S. foreign policy, and then that gets into kind of the propaganda, the mainstream media coverage of this conflict, which has also kind of changed recently. There's been more criticism of Israel, and of course, also the past 20 years in the U.S., with 9/11 and the terror wars, kind of the narrative that, Israel's our greatest ally in the region. They're the only ones that aren't, these crazy Muslims that want to kill us. That was a big thing. I pumped into me as a kid, I remember. I think there's also this narrative that Israel is our aircraft carrier in the region, like, on land or whatever. But the fact is that the U.S. is just also has military bases in the Arab countries. There's only like a small secretive military base in Israel, when the U.S. has always, not that I'm in favor of the U.S. having bases. I don't think we should have any bases in the Middle East at this point. But That just narrative isn't right. I mean, the Gulf Arab countries are ready to play ball with the U.S., ready to do business with the U.S. If anything, Israel is actually an impediment to those relationships and strain those relationships. The Arab countries used to like the U.S. much more before this support, this kind of undying support for Israel.
Yeah, that's the impression I get too, is that the image of America was generally positive in the Middle East. I mean, Israel, and also I would also throw in the overthrow of Mohammed Mossadegh, which certainly drove a wedge between us and Iran, and that's another thing. People like to pretend that you just pretend that it never happened, even though it was very real for the other side. So.
Yeah, I know. Stephen Kinzer is a journalist who wrote a book on the coup, the U.S.-backed coup in Iran, and I've heard him make the point that, like, during the hostage crisis in '79, when they took the American hostages at the U.S. embassy, there was a reason why they went there and did that, was because the coup in '53 was run by the CIA from the U.S. embassy. And Kinzer, I remember mentioning, I think maybe in his book, that nowhere in this constant news coverage of the hostage crisis was that even mentioned. So Americans had no idea. So, and that's another thing. Like, I know kind of Gen X guys that, because of the hostage crisis, they had this instinct to kind of just hate Iran because of that. But again, if you know the history, things happen for a reason. But anyway, there's a lot of examples like that.
I was 8 years old, and that's when you just start to become aware of politics and the news, and that was one of those things. You turn on the news and say, like, day number 1, day number 50, and it never was mentioned. And I don't know if any. You're not supposed to use embassies and diplomats as part of coups. I mean, if you have those things, and it really does. It just breaks down the whole thing. And we haven't had an embassy in Iran since. I mean, we've completely broken off relations there. I mean, I read one of Kinzer's books. That was a good read because I've always wondered about how the Anglo-American oil company or whatever it was. I had an Iranian friend who had told me who refused to get gas at BP because of that. Mm-hmm. He would not go there, all because of that coup. As far as I know,
it's interesting. I mean, it goes to show, like, these interventions that the U.S. does, that the CIA does, that a lot of Americans aren't even aware, like, to the people that live there, like, it's built into their kind of national identity. They remember these things. And to us, it's just like, we barely even notice.
I think the internet is probably making us a little more aware of stuff like this. I don't know if it's helping, but it's certainly not keeping it under wraps. I mean, there's we could talk about the incident in 1967 as well. When I started my podcast, I had a goal: get somebody from the USS Liberty on here. And I mean, that's another thing that seems to be getting more press. Israel's attack on the USS Liberty, which was really just a recon ship in international waters, but they've always claimed that it was just an accident. Yet there's every man who was on that boat thinks it was deliberate.
Yeah. So there's been evidence and leaks, like, from Israeli media that it was deliberate. But yeah, I mean, these things get out. But I definitely think, I mean, especially with social media, you look at the younger generation.
Yeah.
Their view on Israel, whether or not, because it was always kind of more of a left-wing thing in the U.S., well, it doesn't really seem like their political persuasion makes a difference. Young people overall are much more skeptical of this special relationship that the U.S. has with Israel. So I think in the long term, Israel is in trouble when it comes to U.S. support, but it's going to take a while for that to change, and they have a lot of big plans, I think, going forward.
Well, as you point out, giving money to political campaigns, I suspect that, you have intelligence agencies do this. They're probably, planning people inside think tanks as well, and I even think it might be think tanks that you wouldn't necessarily think of being as think tanks that might not necessarily be pro foreign policy. Because I've watched uh, I've watched, I've seen how the Ayn Rand Institute has changed in the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
There was hardly anything coming out of there about Israel 35 years ago.
Yeah.
Or even it all got ramped up after the World Trade Center. And, we could talk about although it wasn't necessarily connected to it, it may not necessarily be connected to Israel. I think we could talk about the World Trade Center because that seems to, be at least blowback from our meddling in the Middle East as well. And yet it still seems to define where our country is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, this is something Scott Horton was tweeting about the other day. There's a quote from Netanyahu from like 9/12, like the next day, saying that it was good for Israel. And then he said like, well, not good, but it makes the U.S. more sympathetic to us. So, like,
yeah,
it's just amazing what he said, like, the day after.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those things like, I mean, especially you look at today, like you talk about blowback.
Yeah.
Is there going to be blowback for the slaughter that's happened over the past year? That this is worse than it's ever been when it comes to Israel's conflicts and occupations. In terms of death, I mean, this is about as bad as it can get. And if there is some sort of attack on the U.S. or U.S. troops, U.S. bases, any sort of significant attack, well, then the U.S. is going to escalate its involvement, and it could really lead to another big Middle East war that the U.S. is directly involved in. Even though everybody knows that that's very foolish, but if Americans die, then that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, nobody was calling for more war when the Beirut bombing happened, and that was about 250 Marines.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder, Dave, this is the wild card. If something like the World Trade Center happens again, or even let's say something happens, let's say some terrorist goes into a building in New York and just kills 50 or 100 people, what will be the public reaction to that? I mean, after the war, you don't mind me asking, how old were you when the World Trade Center happened?
I was 11.
Okay, I was 20. I just turned 30, so so you may not remember that much, but there was all of this go out. I'm proud to be an American. We trust the government. All this crap.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to be the reaction if something like that happens now? I don't think it will be the same. I hope it's not the same.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it would be the same either. And I mean, I really remember that time. I grew up on Long Island.
Okay.
Okay. There was a girl in my class whose dad died. There was 2 firefighters from our town. So like it was.
Oh goodness!
I remember it pretty well. So, and
you had a girl whose dad died. Oh my, that's and she was what 9 years old, like you, or
she was in my class. So we were in 6th grade, so she was 11.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah. So, but I remember that fervor.
That's like one of the worst ages you can possibly lose a parent is when I think you're in like between your 10 and 20, and
yeah, and so I remember that fervor well. And I even remember like as a kid when the Iraq invasion happened, my brother was a few years older. He was in high school and he like knew it was bad, would say why he thought it was wrong. At the time, I remember agreeing with him being like, yeah, we probably shouldn't do it. But like, I just wanted like some kind of war to happen. Like I just still wanted something to happen. Like there to be more people, I guess, being killed. I mean, and I was 13 at the time. Or actually, I was 12 when the invasion happened because that was March 2003. So, and like I remember having that feeling as a kid. So, but I do think it would be different. I mean, I think there would still be that reaction and they would try to gin up the support for war. But I think there would be a lot more people kind of going the other way and calling for restraint. And you mentioned the Beirut barracks bombing. I mean, that's a really important lesson. 250 U.S. Marines killed and Reagan was president. And he decided to pull out. And now we see this right now in the Middle East. The U.S. has these bases in Syria and Iraq that are incredibly exposed, very vulnerable, and they come under these small rocket and drone attacks. And just recently, there were some explosions at a U.S. base, and Biden ordered airstrikes that killed, I think, maybe a dozen of these Iraqi Shia militias that they think were responsible. So, like, even if people don't even have to die, like, the thinking now is, there always has to be a response, not what could we do to kind of make sure this more Americans don't get killed or injured. It's like, nope, we have to respond to anything. That's the attitude. But it does take a Republican, I think, president to be kind of more dovish.
I think the scary part anymore, Dave, I really wonder if morality constrains people from violence at all. And maybe they're simply constrained by the reality that violence can hit you back. Because sometimes I ask myself, what would happen? What would have happened if today the USA still had a monopoly on nuclear weapons? How many atomic bombs would we have dropped? I mean, the atomic bomb didn't become evil until we lost a monopoly on it.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like, would we have dropped 100 bombs because we could have gotten away? I mean, because we could have gotten away with it. Is that, I mean, is it really still just might makes right, and you do what you can get away with? Is that what it is on this planet now? It seems that way.
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of seem like it is that way, especially with Israel. I mean, what they've been doing. I mean, they've basically shown, Iran hasn't done anything. They did show that they can fire some ballistic missiles into Israel and get past their air defenses. And I think if they wanted to fire a whole bunch more, they could do some serious damage. But it's pretty clear that nobody's stopping Israel. And I think one reason why is because Israel has nukes and Iran doesn't, despite all the propaganda about Iran's, supposed ambitions for nuclear weapons. Now, on the other hand, there is, a lot of people inside Iran who are now calling for them to develop nuclear weapons with everything that's going on. But yeah, I mean, it's Israel has nukes and they're backed by the U.S., which the U.S. we couldn't really build up an invasion force to invade Iran. I don't think a war with Iran would look like that. But the U.S. has heavy bombers with these huge bombs that could do some serious damage to the country. So it basically is that threat that's allowing Israel to just do what it's been doing.
Yeah, but you're talking about 80 or 90 million people, which just would be an absolute quagmire. It would be as bad or worse than Vietnam.
Oh yeah,
And
I don't think that there's like any scenario. I mean, I guess there could be some scenario where that would be. I think there is a risk here of a full-blown war in the Middle East between the U.S. and Iran, but I think it would kind of play out maybe in Iraq and with airstrikes and missile strikes against each other's bases mostly. I don't think there would be much ground fighting until somebody throws in the towel.
And didn't the U.S. basically provoke the Iraq war with Iran in the 80s, or because we buddied up to Saddam Hussein?
Yeah. I actually I don't know much about the cause of that war, like the start of that war. But yeah, the U.S. backed him against Iraq, and they knew that he was using chemical weapons and gave him like coordinates for attacks, knowing that he would be using chemical weapons. So that's another part of Iran's kind of national identity, because you look at the government, it's like a revolutionary Islamic government, and kind of their whole thing is like opposing the U.S., opposing Israel, and so you give them reasons for that. It kind of just emboldens the government, like with all the sanctions that the U.S. puts on Iran. That way, any sort of internal economic problems, they could always point, oh, it's the sanctions, it's the U.S., it's the evil empire that's doing this to us. That's kind of another aspect of it, but yeah, I mean, the Iran-Iraq war is really something. I mean, it was like 8 years long, 1 million people died, trench warfare. And then right after that, the U.S. turns around and then makes Saddam the bad guy. Like, it's really incredible.
And I bring that up because I can't think of, I don't know of any time in the 1900s or later that Iran has really started a war with anybody. Which I don't know. Obviously, I don't know. Go back, but it's a very old civilization. I mean, they've certainly had their share of wars with the Russians in the past and some other tribes, but there's nothing recent to have there. So I don't really get the impression that Iran really wants war. But this is one thing I've also commented on about Israel. Hatred of Israel is the only thing that really unifies the Arab and the Muslim world. If Israel wasn't there, they'd be fighting among themselves more. which is not, because, and sometimes I think, when Americans get involved, it's like, well, oh, the Americans here, they're get the Americans out of here, with the exception of the invasion of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, which I think people very much underestimate how significant that was, because that was a year after the Berlin Wall comes down. It was really the first time the U.S. got involved in anything that was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and really didn't need to get involved. And if we don't get involved in that, I think things might be very different right now. I don't think the World Trade Center happens, for example.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that was definitely a big turning point.
Yeah.
And I know, like, my boss Eric Garris and
Yeah.
Justin Raimondo, who those guys founded Antiwar.com. Justin passed away a few years ago.
Yeah. I knew Justin passed away. Yeah. Eric's still around. Yeah.
Yeah, but they were involved because there was, like, the end of the Cold War. There was, like, the kind of paleo conservatives who were, Cold Warriors, like Pat Buchanan, who were Cold Warriors. But, when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Cold War was ending, they wanted to, cut military spending, bring some troops home. They were against that war. So that was a really big turning point. I think that was kind of a sign that, no, like, that's not the way. We're not going to do the peace dividend. We're going to find enemies. And then reading Scott Horton's new book, Provoked, this giant manual about the run up to the current Ukraine war, really starts at the end of the Cold War. It starts with the George H.W. Bush administration. Yeah. Then there's all the interventions in the Balkans, which, again, this is something, like, as an American, I feel so, like, uninformed about. I know more about Kosovo, like when the U.S. Intervened to break Kosovo away from Serbia in the late 90s. But, the way he covers all the interventions in the Balkans, and I didn't even realize, like, that was basically to give NATO a reason to still exist, was to, getting involved in those conflicts and kind of encouraging secession, knowing that it would kind of stir these ethnic tensions and conflicts. So yeah, those are definitely really big turning points.
Yeah, it's definitely happened that way. There was a little bit of protesting against the first Gulf War. The chant was often "No blood for oil," but it didn't really go very much. And I had just turned 8. I was 18, 19 at the time, so I was prime military age. So it was definitely on my mind at the time. It's and I like to say I'm the last of the libertarians who got his libertarian education from book catalogs, as opposed to the internet. But the first libertarian I really went out and read was Thomas Jefferson, because I could find him at the library. But there's this quote I like to repeat over and over, and it's in a letter he wrote to James Monroe in 1823. Quote, "I have ever deemed it fundamental for the U.S. never to take active part in the quarrels of Europe. Their political interests are entirely distinct from ours. Their mutual jealousies, their balance of power, their complicated alliances, their forms and principles of government are all foreign to us. They are nations of eternal war. All their energies are expended in the destruction of the labor, property, and lives of their people." Unquote. What would Thomas Jefferson say about the Middle East? He said that about Europe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, what would he say about, all of this? Not even just the Middle East, but just all the interventions and conflicts around the world, Southeast Asia, and
and in his inaugural address, he says, "Friendly relations with all nations, entangling alliances with none." I mean, even as a teenager, I was asking myself, why are we sticking our nose into all of this? It does. What is the benefit for us? And
there's also, in Washington's farewell address, he had the big kind of foreign policy stuff along similar lines. And there's one part, I forget exactly the wording, but he says, you should not have a special attachment to another nation, because then you will get involved in their wars, and you will think that it's in your interest to help them. And what he said, you could basically describe the U.S. relationship with Israel, like the consequences that he warned could happen are basically what happens today with countries like Israel and these countries where the U.S. must, get involved and everything.
Yeah, and it doesn't really seem to end. I mean, I think that especially since the beginning of the Cold War, it seems like the U.S. is less and less interested in having the moral high ground.
Well, that's one thing with this current Biden government, that they really tried to act like they had the moral high ground for the first couple years with Russia. And kind of Antony Blinken, his style as Secretary of State is kind of this lecturing and acting like, the U.S. always talking about this rules-based international order. But, when it was obvious that they were being hypocrites at the time, because there were examples of them not following the rules and laws that they preach to other countries. But since October 7th, I mean, the hypocrisy is it's almost like overwhelming. Like, look at the ICC thing that just happened, the International Criminal Court. They backed the ICC hard against Russia and Putin, supported them, gave them resources. Now the ICC also goes after Netanyahu, and, they're completely against it, even though they're also going after Hamas leaders and everything. It's just like, again, the hypocrisy is just too much. And other countries.
What you don't mean Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC is.
Oh, yeah, the International Criminal Court.
Okay, yeah, just to clarify that.
Yeah. And also the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is doing this genocide investigation. And, again, they were just preaching all this stuff about international law until now. It all goes out the window.
I think even in World War II, there was at least this attitude of, we don't torture people. That's why we're the good. That's why we're fighting this, is because we're the good guys. But it seems, and I think, and especially after the World Trade Center, it's been completely thrown out the window. So I kind of look, ever since the World Trade Center, I just feel like, what's special about my country now? It's nothing. And of course, the one thing, that I also have reminded people is, and this was with a blue president and the red team controlling both houses of Congress, we had budget surpluses. So that is one thing I want to bring up. What do you think is going to happen now with Donald Trump and some of his cabinet appointments? It seems like it definitely seems like it's a pro-Israel cabinet, although I do think Trump could maybe help end the Ukraine fiasco. It even sounds like he might end Korea, but
yeah.
What about Israel?
I mean, with the stuff he said on the campaign trail.
Yeah.
He's a mixed bag always. Yeah. Trump, like he was saying, he wants it to he's got to bring peace to the Middle East. The war's got to end. But he's also saying that he's gonna, that Biden has abandoned Israel, even though he's given Israel more military aid than any other president in U.S. history. And he's saying, Israel has to finish the job. But, to Israel finishing the job, what they're doing right now, they are currently carrying out like an ethnic cleansing campaign in this section of northern Gaza. It's very clear that that's what's happening. So finishing the job to Israel is finishing that job. He's basically promising to be the most, saying he's the most pro-Israel president ever, saying he's going to give them whatever they want. So I think with Israel, it's just not going to be good. I mean, with Lebanon right now, there's a chance that the Israeli cabinet's supposed to vote on a ceasefire in Lebanon today. So there's a chance that could happen, but I'm skeptical because they've just been bombing Beirut like more than ever. I mean, it's just tough to say what the situation is going to be in 2 months when Trump comes in, because it really seems like Israel's taking advantage of this transition period to do as much as they can. They know Biden's not going to do anything to cut off military aid or anything at this point. And if you look at, one of the big appointees to give us an idea of what Trump's going to be like when it comes to Israel is the ambassador to Israel. And he appointed Mike Huckabee, a former Arkansas governor, who's about as pro-Israel as you can possibly get. He says, God gave Israel, gave this land to the modern state of Israel, and that they have the complete right over the West Bank to annex it. He says he doesn't use the word settlements. He doesn't think that there's a such thing as a Palestinian. Like, these are all things he said on record. So, and then you see kind of the settlers, what they call the far right in Israel, the ones who are openly in favor of annexing the West Bank, and now they want to build settlements in Gaza. They're all very happy about Trump winning, saying it's going to be an opportunity to advance annexation. And if that is what happens, I mean, they're already advancing it, but let's say they do it even more so under this new Trump administration, that's going to stir more conflict. We might see some more organized resistance in the West Bank against Israel. So I think it could just, the conflict could explode even more potentially. At the same time, though, Trump is kind of a wild card. So,
Trump has been a wild card and very erratic on a lot of things, and this is the one thing he's not been erratic about. He's been very consistent about Israel, and that's the scary part. And the other thing too is, even if you have a piece on paper, is it going to be something like the Treaty of Versailles, where 20 years later, the next generation of boys gets up and says, "No, we don't like this treaty. We're ripping it up." That's not peace either. So it's just you're taking a break for 20 years. I really don't know what's going to happen here. What do you think? What do you think will happen with Ukraine? I mean, I had Alex Krainer on it. By the way, you guys should definitely have talked to Alex Krainer. He's a smart guy in Europe who was in the Croatian army. But he said, and I asked him if Trump had been president during the last 4 years, will we have this war with Ukraine? He said no. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough to say what would happen if Trump was president for the past 4 years. But when it comes to him ending the war now, I think there are good signs that he really campaigned on it. He was saying he's going to end the war. He never really laid out a plan. JD Vance was a little more articulate about it, saying they would freeze the lines, do this, do that. But I think it's good that we have a president who's coming in and basically saying he's going to talk to Putin. He wants to make a deal. He wants to end the war. And so there were some cabinet appointments that were kind of a bad sign towards that, including Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, which is just kind of a bad sign. I mean, he's about as hawkish as you can get. And also Mike Waltz as his national security advisor, also extremely hawkish. He was calling for the U.S. to do all sorts of escalations in Ukraine. But I saw him on, Fox News the other day, asked about Biden's recent escalations in Ukraine, signing off on the long-range strikes in Russia, which really seriously risks World War III, because Russia has made that very clear that they're going to respond to this in some kind of big way. But anyway, Mike Waltz was asked about that. And he's actually even said recently, just before the election, that they should give Ukraine the ability to launch those long-range strikes. But in this interview he just did the other day, he's saying we're going to get in and end the war. We got to end this war. The escalation's too out of control. So the fact that Mike Waltz is saying that too, I think is a good sign that they're going to try to end it, or at least get a ceasefire, and then enter some sort of negotiations.
I certainly know, even Russian activists who will tell you that Putin is a dictator. Putin does not fit the profile. If you look at Alexander, he was in his 20s. Old men generally aren't as ambitious. If you look at history, I mean, Putin's an old man, really. They're usually a little more cool. They're usually a little more calm and cool. He hasn't went on a rampage like, the equivalent of Hitler or Genghis Khan. I don't think he's even come close. I mean, he's certainly been in these wars, but I don't think he's moved very slowly. So I don't think he's going to try to take over all of Europe, which is what they try to say he wants to do. But
I think that's that idea that, once he's done in Ukraine, he's going to go into Poland. I think that's just complete nonsense. I mean, he's never expressed.
He's got to go through Belarus anyway. But I have told my Polish friends and my Kartvelian friends in Tbilisi, I said, you need to have 2 pistols, 1 rifle, and 50 rounds for each one.
Mm-hmm.
And just sit on them and be ready. And I have said to them, I wish you had nukes too, but because I know people, and I have to admit, after having visited these countries, it's harder to watch it happen. There are a few countries I'd fight for after visiting them, but
I've been to Poland. Poland's beautiful.
Poland's wonderful.
I've been to Latvia too, which is really cool.
Yeah, and
they're right there.
Yeah, in Tbilisi, I never saw a place where there were more Ukrainian flags than in Tbilisi.
Yeah.
They do not want the, and yet, I also visited Armenia at the same time. There was not a single Ukrainian flag there, and that's because the Armenians hate the Turks, but for obvious reasons. But
yeah,
both beautiful countries, definitely worth visiting. But
yeah. But I think, I think there is the risk of war here is Russia saying, okay, that's enough, with NATO supporting these attacks on Russia and potentially striking a base, a NATO base in Poland or something.
And having I don't think I need to read well obviously I'd get a lot of details, but having watched it happen, I kind of know what's in Scott's book. Because I was asking myself, if the Cold War is over, why does NATO still exist? This was another case of an organization looking for something to do once its original purpose was gone. And there were, also we should point out too, Russell, the old Russell Kirk, who was, one of the more older conservatives, was asking, the Cold War is over. We don't need to do this anymore. It seems as though I think they were probably disappointed that the Soviet Union fell. And they said, well, we can figure something else out to do here. Go after and create a more eternal war and go out and coddle more dictators who are horrible, but they're not communists.
And do things like in the name of humanitarian intervention.
It's funny because I think Wilson had more of a vision of what he was fighting for. But I think the Cold Warriors are just really focused more on what they oppose. And if you look at all the great moral stories, the warrior who starts out for a cause, but then he gets so focused on punishing his enemy, and that's when he turns into the bad guy. That's what ultimately happened with Anakin Skywalker. And we've now, that's the hardest thing in the world in politics, is you have to stay focused on, this is what I'm for. When you get obsessed with just punishing what you hate, it goes off the rails. But, I should ask too, what do you think? It seems like Trump could actually end the Korean War, which strictly speaking is still at a 70+ year ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. Well,
there's a demilitarized zone. There's never been a treaty. So,
that was one of, I think, the best things he did in his term was go and meet with Kim Jong-un, because that is just something that needs to be resolved. There's just, it's just completely ridiculous that that's the state of things are still like that. There's a few, and I think he's going to still want to try that. There's a few things roadblocks that he might have. One is that the current president of South Korea doesn't want reunification. Like the previous president, Moon, was pro reunification and everything. And then now Yoon is the president, and he kind of ran on being more hawkish on North Korea and on China. But his party lost big in the parliamentary elections. So I think there is, I think overall the sentiment in the country would be to reduce tensions, because just in the past few years, they restarted this kind of cycle of escalation, like big war games between the U.S. and South Korea. North Korea launches missiles. They do more war games in response. North Korea fires some things, and they send trash balloons over or whatever. So I think, but the president is still, I think he still has a few years left in his term. So I'm not sure if he would go for any like reunification talks but I guess if Trump, if the U.S. decided, because it is the U.S. that has their big military there and backs South Korea. I guess if they decide, that they want to cool things down, that they probably can. But the other thing I think that's a potential roadblock is that the Trump administration, they're all going to be China hawks. And I think a big reason why we've seen over the past few years the U.S. really ramp up its war games in South Korea, its military presence in South Korea again, is kind of more aimed at China than North Korea, I think. So I think the China hawks are going to try to convince Trump and say, hey, look, we want to keep this stuff here and all that. But hopefully he has, he goes against that, because I mean, again, I think it's kind of a potential easy win. Again, even just to cool tensions, like his meetings with Kim, they didn't really solve anything. But for a while, there wasn't these missile tests and war games going on. And Even just getting back to that would be good.
Yeah, you also have the situation with Taiwan, which is very interesting. That's one place I'd like to visit. The Korean situation has become very interesting because South Korea has certainly done very well with becoming a lot of high tech stuff coming out of there, but also that country is just probably the worst baby bust in the world. I mean, I think there's something like now 0.7 kids per woman there now, and I don't know how you're going to. I mean, if there was a war between North and South Korea, I mean, South Korea being richer would probably. It's hard to tell what would happen in that situation, you know. And I want to point out we do not advise going to North Korea or Turkmenistan for that matter, because these are just places where you can get in trouble very easily and bad things can happen, as we saw with Otto Warmblur. So don't go there. But yeah, it's and there's other policies too that countries have that are, for example, if a North Korean escapes and ends up in Mongolia and the Mongolians want to deport them, they send them to South Korea.
Oh yeah.
which might be what they really wanted anyway, you know.
Yeah.
That's because I guess because when you have a demilitarized zone there, it's not easy to cross it. You know, that's one thing. If there was just a ceasefire and no demilitarized zone, you'd probably have North Koreans flooding South Korea pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I suppose maybe you could go out in a boat or something, you know, just a little boat and just kind of row your way. But most of the North Koreans escape, end up going to China. And I actually was in Mongolia 5 years ago. A lot of them end up in Mongolia, which is.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's cool. I want to go to Mongolia.
There were a lot of. I just remember seeing all the Korean restaurants there, you know, and whereas China's, you know, 1 billion people, Mongolia has the same population as Utah, and it's 7 times the land area. So it's a very sparsely populated country that has lots of room. So, yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that's going to happen here. I mean, what do you think could happen with China, though? You know, it might not be a good idea if we brought our chip manufacturing back here, but that's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, I mean, China's a big thing. You know, it's like one thing about Democrats and Republicans, they're all pretty much on the same page now that China's like they call the biggest threat to the U.S. And the U.S. has been undertaking kind of this new military buildup in the region, in the Philippines, getting really involved in this dispute in the South China Sea, like actually deploying troops to support the Philippines and stuff, and kind of expanding bases on these specific island nations and in Australia and Japan. And they are actually openly planning for war with China over Taiwan. Like they're saying basically preparing for like a direct war, not like Ukraine, which is really kind of crazy because China they don't have as many nukes as Russia, but they have enough, you know? So it's definitely an area that I think needs kind of more eyes and people to kind of question this march toward war that's happening there, that it's kind of going on under the radar because of everything that's happening in Ukraine and the Middle East. But it's, you know, things are really heating up over there.
Yeah, you know, one thing I remember too that was really weird. If you remember that case where the Ukrainian guy went into the Canadian Parliament and they realized that he was actually a Ukrainian nationalist who, you know, in picking which bad guy is worse, it says, okay, I'm actually going to fight against Stalin and the guy who gave us this big famine. So he actually went on the side of the Nazis, and it was funny how the whole thing in Israel just happened right after that. It's almost like they wanted to distract us from that, you know. And and of course, we can't really talk about the Ukraine war without talking about, you know, the famine that happened there in 32 and 33. I mean, killed 5 or 6 million. Of course, they all, you know, at the same time, they also killed about 1 million Kazakhs. You know, Russia has never really been a sympathetic character either, but
and I don't think I'm in a position to judge someone who was living under Soviet occupation and then picked one side over the other. Like, and can't imagine what that was like.
And one common theme I hear from a lot of the people I talk to, a lot of people said to me, I have family on both sides of this. You know, there's a lot of intermarrying between the Ukrainians and Russians, and I've been trying to get a good Russian libertarian on here, but they do not want to talk. I guess I can't blame them, but Yeah, very, very interesting situation. So, Dave, what do we do to get out of this? What do we do to get back to the roots of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington? That I mean, sometimes I think the only thing that's going to end our empire is a civil war. We don't seem
Yeah,
to be able
well,
to vote our way out of it.
yeah, no, that I certainly don't think we can vote our way out of it. I mean, you need serious, reform. When it comes to the empire, I mean, it's tough to even say. This current government, this current model, I think is beyond reform, because what we would really need is kind of just a total new way of thinking about the government and the empire. I mean, we could bring troops home. We would have to bring troops home, close all these bases. We have to change our financial system, our monetary system, get real money again. I think would be the real solution. So we wouldn't just be able to print money to fund all these wars and everything. So yeah, I mean, I just think we are a long way off from that. It's tough for me to come up with real libertarian solutions to things. But I think when it comes to kind of more to things that could happen, I mean, if just more Americans wake up to this idea of empire, which I think a lot more people are as they see the U.S. spending so much on Ukraine, on Israel, when things have been tough here in the U.S. for people. We can't get involved in all these conflicts and expect to, we're basically an overstretched empire. And a big reason why is all the sanctions on these countries and these alternate economic systems that are forming in response to that. If we keep going on this path, the empire is going to collapse in some way.
Yeah. Just recently, there are people out there, who got hit by these hurricanes, and they're saying to themselves, my government cares more about, rebuilding infrastructure in Israel than it does care about rebuilding infrastructure here. Whether you think, the government should be involved in disaster relief is another debate, but DeSantis is very pro-Israel, but he actually sent stuff to North Carolina. Says, "Oh, North Carolina, you need help. I'll help you out." Which to his credit, and DeSantis has a reputation of being a great governor in disasters, but there's just this whole attitude of, our room is a mess, but we're going around and cleaning up everybody else's room, and I just don't get it. And I often say to people, we just don't have the moral high ground anymore. And I just don't know where we go from here, or where we get out of it. It just doesn't. It seems like it can't get worse, but it does.
I mean, I think it's tough to predict things, but I still think you never know what's going to happen. There's always all these factors of different wars starting. But I do think that the U.S. is going to be able to still go on like this for a while before like China and Russia and like the BRICS countries become like a real economic threat. Like the U.S. dollar is still going to be dominant for a while. These countries still all have like their reserves and treasuries and stuff in the dollar, even if they're trading with their own currency. But it is like, this empire can't go on like this forever. So it is only a matter of time before there is some sort of real crisis and real collapse. And then hopefully when that happens, it's not a complete disaster. Hopefully it's more like the Soviet Union where, there were little wars that popped up, but it was not nearly as bloody as people thought it would be.
Sometimes I like to say that in the future, your nationality will be determined by what cryptocurrency you use. So we'll have Ethereum nation, we'll have Bitcoin nation, we'll have Cardano nation, Solana nation, Ripple nation, and that'll just be, and it'll just be all cryptocurrency people. But that's a fantasy that probably it's hard to say where we're going to go with that, and also I think I do want to, that does bother me. Israel has this, massive surveillance state. And I know Peter Thiel is very close to the Trump campaign and some of these other people, and he's very much in the thick of this surveillance software. I mean, what do you got any opinions on that? Or, this might be the scariest part of the Trump administration, especially now that we have, this is just like, when George Bush had both houses of Congress too.
Yeah, no, there's a real concern with that, especially because you see the Republicans are passing all this legislation meant to basically crack down on like speech that's
Yeah.
critical of Israel. Basically, they
Oh
conflate
yeah.
it all with anti-Semitism. They want to apply it to these anti-discrimination laws and everything.
Yeah.
I think that's something we really have to worry about with
Yeah.
the Republicans in control and Trump's attorney general now. I think Matt Gaetz would have been a little better on it, but this new woman,
Yeah.
Pam Bondi, I think she'll be bad. I think that's a serious concern. And the
Yeah.
surveillance, the Democrats are kind of more openly about like wanting to crack down on speech on the internet, but I do think the Republicans, definitely want to do it in their own way as well.
Yeah.
And Israel's a big part of it. And we saw talking. This is kind of unrelated, but one thing I always remember is during the COVID and the vaccine mandates and stuff. I think kind of the most egregious attack on civil liberties during that time was the vaccine passports in like New York City. I think they did them in Washington, D.C., where you had to show them a pass, your passport, to get into a restaurant or something like that. That was modeled on the Green Pass in Israel.
Yes.
They had to do that in the whole country, and they had vaccine mandates and everything. So
Yeah,
they
it
do
seems
things
like
that the U.S. kind of models.
we're kind of IDFing our own country or Mossading our. Before we go, I know you got to go pretty soon. There has been even some talk that they want to send in troops to Mexico to go after the drug cartels. Now, if my country starts sending troops into Mexico, I'm going to go to Mexico and fight for Mexico. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. We've screwed up that country so many different ways. In fact, if we legalized drugs, it would solve a lot of their problems. But what do you make of all that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother thing.
Just posturing.
Man, I mean, there have really been a lot of Republicans have been talking about that, and Trump's been talking about that. I mean, that would just be like sending troops. I've seen people talk about, they could send the special forces in and they destroy the cartels. But the cartels, I mean, they have territory. They have serious weapons. Like, they would be a serious fight. Like, it's not like it's just some like small insurgent group or something. And that would bring war to the U.S. That would bring war to the border areas. And this is such a foolish idea. And, I don't really know, is it just posturing or not? It seems like it's much more popular. It's more popular kind of than I thought. I've been kind of looking around lately, seeing all these politicians calling for that idea to take military action against, over fentanyl, which you look at the size, you could smuggle fentanyl in anything. I mean, there's no way they're going to be able to crack down on that unless, again, a libertarian solution obviously is ending the drug war and giving people safe options so they don't, die when they do these drugs.
Yeah.
But the talk is, oh no, we have to go to war with the cartels. It's just like, that's just going to make everything worse.
Yeah, it'll be like, when they sent in General Pershing to go get Pancho Villa, and it just ended up being a game of cat and mouse that the Mexicans actually became sympathetic to Villa because he was, not getting captured by the military, even though Villa was kind of a gangster. I think it's going to go silly. Not to mention, you do not want to fight a war in the Arizona desert. I mean, that's just nuts. There haven't been very many wars fought in places like this. And when you try to fight a war there, you find out why. You're wearing it's 120 degrees and you're wearing all your military gear. You'll have people, it'll be the first war where you'll have 10% of the casualties dying from heat exhaustion. I mean,
and they'll be completely on the cartel's turf with all their tunnel systems and stuff. It's just total.
Oh, yeah. And they have more incentive because they have the profit motive. That's just nuts. Yeah. Well, it's been good talking to you, Dave. Do you have anything else you want to say before we go?
No, I think that's it. Hopefully we make it. I think, there's a lot of risk right now with escalation in Ukraine and Russia. Yeah. It's certainly just that place to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it'll be, and maybe they'll figure out. And the worst thing is they might try to figure out something new they want to fight. But, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village, check out my Substack, and go to buymeacoffee.com. Thank you, Dave DeCamp. Where can we find you out there?
All my writing is at antiwar.com. You can follow me on Twitter.
Yes.
At DeCamp Dave is my handle there. And then I also have my show called Antiwar News. It's on YouTube or Rumble, wherever you watch
Yes.
videos.
And you do have some things at LI too, right?
They reprint a lot of my stuff, but I don't really
Okay.
have much over there.
Okay, yeah, I know they're separate organizations. You don't have any books yet, but you'll probably have some in the future. But yeah,
One day.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dave Camp. Dave Camp, we're out. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.